On Christmas Eve, 1968, astronaut Bill Anders snapped a photo of the Earth as Apollo 8 orbited the moon. Those three guys were surprised to see from their eyes a planet looked like an Earthrise, a blue orb hovering over the moon's gray horizon with deep oceans and silver skies. It was our world's first glance at itself, a first chance to see a shared reality, a declared stance, and a commonality, a glimpse into our planet's mirror. And as threats drew nearer, our own urgency became clearer as we realized that we hold nothing dearer than this floating body we all call home. We've known that we're caught in the throes of climactic changes some say will just go away, while some simply pray to survive another day. For it is the obscure, the oppressed, the poor who, when the disaster is declared done, still suffer more than anyone. Climate change is the single greatest challenge of our time. Of this, you're certainly aware. It's saddening, but I cannot spare you from knowing an inconvenient fact, because it's getting the facts straight that gets us to act and not to wait. So I tell you this not to scare you, but to prepare you, to dare you to dream a different reality where, despite disparities, we all care to protect this world, this riddled blue marvel, this little true marvel, to master the verve and the nerve to see how we can serve our planet. You don't need to be a politician to make it your mission to conserve, to protect, to preserve that one and only home that is ours. To use your unique power to give next generations the planet they deserve. We are demonstrating, creating, advocating. We heed this inconvenient truth because we need to be anything but lenient with the future of our youth. And while this is a training in sustaining the future of our planet, there is no rehearsal. The time is now, because the reversal of harm and protection of a future so universal should be anything but controversial. So, Earth, pale blue dots, we will fail you not. Just as we chose to go to the moon, we know it's never too soon to choose hope. We choose to do more than cope with climate change. We choose to end it. We refuse to lose. We do this and more, not because it's very easy or nice, but because it is necessary. Because with every dawn we carry the weights of the fates of this celestial body orbiting a star, and as heavy as that weight sounded, it doesn't hold us down, but it keeps us grounded, steady, ready, because an environmental movement of this size is simply another form of an Earthrise. To see it, close your eyes, visualize that all of us in this room and outside of these walls or in these halls, all of us change makers, or in a spacecraft floating like a silver raft in space, and we see the face of a planet anew. We relish the view, we witness its round green and brilliant blue, which inspires us to ask deeply, wholly, what can we do? Open your eyes, know the future of this wise planet is right in sight, right in all of us. Trust this earth uprising, all of us bring light to exciting solutions never tried before, for it is our hope that implores us at our uncompromising core to keep rising up for an earth more than worth fighting for.
Thank you, Ron and Beth, for sharing that piece. It's a very powerful piece. My name is Kiara Winans. I, along with Jason Quinn and Yuan Yao, have had the opportunity to chair this conference this year. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the International Symposium on Sustainable Systems and Technology, ISSST 2021, and to express gratitude to Beth Schaefer, the ISSST Executive Director, the program committee, and all who put forward submissions for this year's conference. It has been an honor, a true honor, to work with you all to help put together this conference this year. And together, I feel like we have created an outstanding program. I want to also thank our sponsors, the National Science Foundation, Earth Shift Global, Infrastructures Journal, and ASU Meta Center. Now I'll hand it over to Peter Canepa.
Awesome, thanks, Chiara. Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Canepa, and I will be introducing the speaker today. So let me get right to it, and I'll cover a few housekeeping bits at the end, and then hand it over to our speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Anders Bjørn. He is the speaker today, and he is a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Over the past decade, Anders has worked on linking planetary boundaries, or the planetary boundaries framework, with life cycle assessment, explicitly to facilitate so-called absolute environmental sustainability assessment. And this broader view allows researchers and practitioners to shift from deducing whether something is simply less bad to understanding whether it's good enough for the environment. This approach can also help to derive science-based targets for the future environmental performance of entities like companies or cities or even technologies. Anders' current research evaluates the integrity of science-based targets or net zero targets for greenhouse gas emissions that are set by large corporations. Additionally, Anders is the founder and co-manager of the research network entitled LCA Absolute, which aims to support the development and use of LCA for absolute environmental sustainability assessments. He holds a master's degree in environmental engineering from the Technical University of Denmark, where he has also completed his PhD, perhaps the world's first on the topic of LCA-based absolute environmental sustainability assessment. I'm going to turn it over to Anders shortly. After his talk, we'll hold a Q&A session. I implore you to write your questions in the chat throughout his presentation as you think of them. And I will be monitoring that and asking those to Anders at the end. Similarly, if you prefer to just raise your hand, you can use the Zoom function to do that at the end of the talk, and just ask your question as I call on you. So without further ado, Anders, thank you for being here today, and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Peter. It's really a great honor to have been invited to sort of open up the scientific aspects of this event with a keynote presentation. So I will try to share my screen.
Looks good, we see it.
It looks good, that's great. I'll just go into, make sure I have the right settings on, just a moment. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. So the title of my presentation is Linking LCA with Planetary Boundaries. So first of all, let's go back a few years. How did I get into this? So around 10 years ago, I was learning about life cycle assessment at different courses at the Technical University of Denmark. And I remember thinking, this seems like a really, really powerful approach. I also remember thinking, why is it always used to answer boring questions? Obviously, I was not a coffee drinker at the time, but I found it boring. I remember that the LCA was always presented as something that could tell you what the best way of drinking coffee is. Also, I remember thinking that it is framed as a sustainability tool, but I really didn't see the link to the big picture that was just explained to us in this Earthrise video just a few minutes ago. And also, I sort of realized that it tells you if something is better than something else, but not if it's good enough or not where to aim on a more sort of long-term basis. This photo is, you see Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor of California at the time, and he was promoting biofuels by having his own Hummer retrofitted so it could run on biofuels. And I remember thinking, what happens if every person on the planet had a Hummer that runs on vegetable oil? At the same time, I was really inspired by the cradle-to-cradle concept and the planetary boundaries concept that both have just emerged around that time. And both of these concepts sort of contain a vision, a grand vision of what a sustainable society looks like, not in very detailed terms, but in sort of abstract terms, and contains some high-level criteria that must be fulfilled to meet this sort of sustainable state. And I thought this was really motivating to work with an orientation towards a sort of ideal state, rather than just trying to make things a little bit less bad. So I shared some of these thoughts with Michael Hauschild, who was giving the LCA course at DTU, the Technical University of Denmark at the time. And it kind of ended up with me becoming a PhD student. And the rest is history. I've pretty much been wrestling with these questions ever since, of how to link this very detail-oriented life cycle assessment approach to sort of big picture sustainability visions. So now that you know a bit about my personal motivation for going into this line of work, I want to tell you why I think that we need a paradigm shift in the way that we apply life cycle assessment. So pretty much any good or service that you can think of has evolved to impact the environment less over time. It's sort of the eco-efficiency of the product, whether it's a good or a service, tend to increase over time. And there's no doubt that life cycle assessment has helped guide this process because it, as you know, it enables to identify low-hanging fruits in terms of eco-efficiency improvements in a life cycle, and it allows to avoid or at least account for burden shifting across different life cycle stages and different environmental impacts. But the state of the environment is really not looking too good. These charts are for different environmental state indicators, so concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, nitrogen to coastal zones, and other things. And they start in the year 1750, so 200 and nearly 300 years ago, and go on until present times. And what you can see is that there's really a sort of acceleration. It's kind of a hockey stick shape in many cases, with an acceleration starting around the year around the 1950s. And the reason for that is that the fundamental drivers are the increase in population that have been experienced globally, and the increase in affluence per capita. What we also know is that there's an increase in the inequality of affluence per capita. So it doesn't mean that every single person on the planet is over-consuming, obviously, but a lot of us are consuming a lot. So therefore, the number of products that are being produced and consumed are dramatically increasing over time. And this is why, even though every product keeps being produced at a more efficient way, we still see that things are going in the wrong direction at the global scale when it comes to many types of environmental impacts. So better is not necessarily good enough. It's kind of like the goal of product level environmental improvement is a moving target. You never get to the goal. You always have to improve more. And maybe the finish line is even going further away from you in some cases. So what could a paradigm shift involve? Well, I think it involves three basic ideas. The first idea is to recognize that we are constrained by carrying capacities. This is this gentleman here is Hans Karl von Karlowitsch, and he was a German tax accountant and mining administrator. And he wrote a book nearly 300 years ago, actually more than 300 years ago, that became a bestseller. And the title of the book was Silvicultura Economica. And in that book, he essentially pointed out the problem that if we keep chopping down forest faster than it can regrow, eventually we get into trouble. And he was observing that with his own eyes because the mining industry was claiming so much forest, so much lumber, that they had to go further and further away to find new trees that hadn't been cut yet. And so with this kind of line of thinking in that publication, he sort of gave birth to the idea that the environment has certain constraints that humans sort of have to adapt to. Even with all our ingenuity, that there are some constraints that we cannot overcome. And fast forward 300 years, and this idea of carrying capacities has really become widely associated with the planetary boundaries framework. There's even a new Netflix documentary that is basically explaining what planetary boundaries are in a sort of popular way, starring David Attenborough and Johan Rockström. Johan Rockström is the guy to the right, and he was one of the sort of chief scientists behind the planetary boundaries framework and continue working on its evolvement. And so to jump into the planetary boundaries framework, before presenting the framework itself, I want to present what its premises are. So the first premise is that a stable environment is not a given. We cannot take the environment that we know and have come to know, have evolved in, we cannot take that for granted. This chart here, it shows how the mean atmospheric temperature, that's on the right axis, has evolved for the past 100,000 years. And then below you see different sort of key events in the development of humanity, one could say, that happened at these different times where temperature levels were different. And what you can see is that the measure of mean temperature has really only been stable the past 10,000 years. Before that, it was a pretty rocky bump. Of course, this is a long scale. You know, it's not like from one day to another, you suddenly had a dramatic change. But still, it's only the last 10,000 years that we have had this kind of nice, stable environment where also the beginning of agriculture happened and great European civilizations emerged. So the premise is also that the Holocene epoch, which is geological epoch, maybe I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but the Holocene time is really good for human development, and we should try to keep it that way. And that sort of links to the second premise, is that humans have really become a geological force now in the sense that we are impacting the environment at a scale that is comparable to what geological forces have done in the past. And this is why some scientists are arguing that we now live in the Anthropocene. And so putting those two premises together, you know, since geological forces have led to really radical changes in the Earth system in the past, humans, we now have the power, whether we want it or not, we have the power to make such changes as well. But it's really in our interest to keep the Earth system in a state that resembles the Holocene. So the framework is composed of a set of planetary and also regional boundaries. And I'll get back to the question of regionality later in the presentation. So you can see there are 9 sort of impact categories. They look quite similar to what we call impact categories in life cycle systems. You have climate change, you have stratospheric ozone depletion, you have ocean acidification. You know, these names are not too far away from what we know from LCA. And so the boundaries sort of shown here. So this is where, if you stay within the boundary, we are likely to maintain the Earth system in a Holocene-like state. And so the space inside that is sort of defined by the boundary is also referred to as the safe orbiting space. And this is more or less the same as carrying capacity. It has a more explicit, it has a more restrictive meaning than the carrying capacity concept, but it's a type of carrying capacity. Boundary values themselves, they have been derived using threshold and resilience theories. And so it's not an exact predictive science. for some thresholds, we only really know after we have passed them where they are located. And because of that, in the planetary boundaries framework, they use a sort of traffic light system that goes from safe, which is inside the green zone, to the zone of uncertainty, which is the yellow part here, and then finally the high risk zone, the red zone. And you see that according to the last sort of assessment for biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus emissions, and also for biosphere integrity, we are now in the high risk zone. And it doesn't mean that we have already set in motion a process that sort of pushes the planet to another state than the Holocene, but the longer we stay in this high risk scenario, the more likely it is that something like that will happen. The second idea, so the first idea was that we are constrained by carrying capacities or the safe orbiting space. And so the second idea is that we should somehow find a way to divide the safe orbiting space, the SOS, between different actors in society. So that could be nations, cities, individuals, industrial sectors, companies, products, etc., technologies. And this way of looking at things is also commonly applied when sort of discussing how to allocate rights or burdens between countries when it comes to staying within the global remaining carbon budget. This slide here to the right is from a presentation from the British climate scientist Kevin Anderson, who you might know. So the cake or the pie metaphor is kind of common. And I'll get back to later some potential problems with this metaphor. But now I'd like to sort of introduce it as a concept that is important in absolute sustainability assessment or in planetary boundaries-based LCA. And so the third idea is really to compare this assigned or allocated safe orbiting space to whatever it is that you're studying. You compare that to the actual impact of what you're studying. And so this is what we call an absolute environmental sustainability assessment, or ASA. And so if the impact is smaller or equal to the assigned share, then the system you're studying can be judged to be environmentally sustainable. If that is not the case, then it's the other way around. It's environmentally unsustainable. And when that's the case, which it will often be, then you can use also the methodological approach to set the targets for the reduction of impacts in the future. I'll get back to an example of that later. Okay, so now we have the concept more or less introduced, and now I'm gonna explain a bit how LCA and planetary boundaries can be linked in a more on a more practical level. So there are really two different ways that this link can happen. Either we can go from the existing midpoint impact categories that we know from LCA and then try to match them with the planetary boundaries. This leads to a comprehensive coverage of impact categories, at least from the perspective of life cycle assessment people like us. But it doesn't exactly match the indicators or the language that's used in the planetary boundaries framework. That can be a weakness in some contexts. And to give you an example, I developed as part of my PhD a set of carrying capacity-based normalization factors that followed this approach, where there's basically a carrying capacity for each impact category. And some of them are completely aligned with a planetary boundary, and others are aligned with other thresholds that have been that we identified in the environmental science literature, but that is not part of the planetary boundaries framework. The other way is to really bypass all those traditional LCA impact categories that we know and love, and make direct links between a life cycle inventory and the indicators, the planetary boundaries framework. And so the advantage of this approach is that it better aligns with the indicators and the language used in the planetary boundaries framework. Disadvantage is that it misses certain impacts that we commonly include in life cycle assessment. For example, there's no planetary boundary for non-renewable resource use. And that's because the Earth system is not really directed, it's not really affected by resource scarcity. Resource scarcity is more of a problem for humans and our economy. It's not something that by itself can push the Earth system into a different state, at least not in a direct way. Of course, indirectly, there are all sorts of problems, emissions, etc., associated with renewable, non-renewable resource use. Right, and so an example was there was a method developed by my colleagues at the Technical University of Denmark a few years after the study you see above here. And in that study here, they developed a set of characterization factors that basically allows LCA practitioners to link traditional life cycle inventory to the exact indicators used in the planetary boundaries framework. And so this chart is from a literature review I did a couple of years ago with around 20 other researchers from the LCA community that are, like me, working on creating these kinds of links between PB and LCA. And you can see that the number of studies that deal with this link has increased a lot recently. For example, in 2018 alone, we had 11 studies published. And so the statistics are a couple of years old, but my gut feeling is that there has been even a greater increase in annual studies produced in the years that followed. So it's not just me that is working on this. Fortunately, there's a lot of researchers worldwide that is starting to look into this, have looked into it for quite some years now. So now I'll give 3 examples of how PB-LCA can be applied to answer different questions in very different contexts. The first example is a bit, I'm kind of cheating because it's not, strictly speaking, it's not PB-LCA because it only includes climate change. But I think it's a very important example of how you can use absolute sustainability assessment to set targets and get a lot of actors on board in the process. So the example is the science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions at the company level. And this is something that has been driven, you could say, by something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTI, which is a coalition between CDP, WWF, World Resources Institute, and UN Global Compact. And they define a science-based target as being in line with what the latest climate science says is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the first couple of years, it was a little bit slow in terms of how many companies set these targets and had targets certified by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But especially the last couple of years, you really start seeing a lot. So last fall, 500 companies had set targets, and another 500-600 companies had committed to setting targets. And those 500 companies that had set targets, so these guys here, they represent, with their current emissions, nearly 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions from energy and industry. And that's considering just scope 1 and 2, so not their full life cycles, but just their direct emissions and their emissions from electricity use, and if they use other energy flows. And to put that into perspective, is nearly twice the territorial emissions of Canada, which is where I am speaking from right now. And since then, which is less than a year later than that this statistics was produced, you now have nearly 800 companies that have set targets, and another roughly 800 companies that have committed to setting targets. So in total, you have more than 1,500 companies that are taking action, as they say. So it's really something that is increasing quite rapidly. However, it's not all perfect from my perspective, at least. I do want to mention that there's a lack of transparency around science-based targets. First of all, the different methods that companies can use to set science-based targets, they are not presented in a clear and a comparable way by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And it's not really clear how each individual science-based target has been calculated either. You can see a list of companies and their targets, but you don't see how the target itself was calculated. So you actually don't know anything about what allocation principle was used to break down the global carbon budget to the company level. And we tried to raise this issue. A couple of months ago, we published a paper where we characterized all the target setting methods and we applied them on a set of hypothetical companies. And I'm not going to go into details, but you can have a look at the study later if you're interested. The second example of PB-LCA in application is a study by Algunaibe. I'm probably not pronouncing the name correctly. If you are with us here today, sorry about that. Algunaibe and colleagues, they published a study a couple of years ago where they compared different scenarios of the future US electricity system to planetary boundaries. So the starting point of their assessment was the planetary boundaries themselves. Then they had one step in the allocation process, or the downscaling process, as they call it, where they went from the planetary level to the level of the US as a whole, based on the share of global population that lives in US. And in a second level, they went from the share to the US. They kind of cut the piece one more time, the pie piece, to identify the share to the US power sector alone compared to all the other sectors in the US. And this was done by the share of gross value added that is generated by the power sector compared to other sectors. And then they fed these downscale planetary boundaries as constraints into an energy systems model. And meanwhile, they had the life cycle inventories of different electricity technologies. And they combined those life cycle inventories with a planetary boundaries based life cycle assessment method, actually the one I mentioned before that was developed also at the Technical University of Denmark. And by that, they had the elementary flow and the characterization factors, and those were also fed into the energy systems model. And so first they generated a 2030 scenario for the US electricity system that's based on business as usual development. And here you can see that it was mainly that the colors here represent the different energy. It's the energy mix, and it's the different energy technologies involved. So you see it's mainly coal, natural gas, and nuclear. And by comparison, wind is really a minor component here. And so the results, they displayed them in a spiderweb plot, where each planetary boundary impact category is sort of a square, known as square triangle. And then the impact categories that have red or yellow fill, so this one, for example, they are either in the high risk or the uncertainty zone, as opposed to being in the safe zone. You can see the contribution of the different energy technologies in the mix to the impacts here in the borders of the circle. So it's quite informative. There's a lot of information in this diagram, but it basically boils down to the fact that 6 out of 8 planetary boundaries are exceeded, and some are exceeded by more than 3 orders of magnitude, such as one for climate change. You see what's it called? The scale down here. So then they tried to, with the energy system model, they tried to generate a different scenario. First, they tried to find a solution where not a single planetary boundary was exceeded, but they couldn't find that. And then they found the sort of second best solution, which is where only one planetary boundary is exceeded, or the downscaled boundary is exceeded, which is the one for nitrogen flows. This, you can see, is a very different electricity mix than what you had in the business as usual. It's actually mainly wind onshore and offshore, and natural gas with carbon sequestration and storage, and then some other technologies. Right. The third example I want to give is of all the consumption that takes place inside the European Union. So consumption of all goods and services inside the Union. This is a study that was published last year, and it was a collaboration between the environmental protection agencies of Switzerland and the European Union. And they used, as you can probably guess, they used environmentally extended input-output modeling to model the impacts, the footprint, the embedded consumption impacts. And what they really focused on in this study, where they put a lot of effort into, was to calculate for a range of different allocation principles. They calculated different shares of the global safe operating space for the European Union. So they have equality, needs, right to development, sovereignty, and capabilities. And each of these are actually classes of allocation principles, because they calculate, there are different sub-principles within. So there are really a lot of different ways of thinking about what is a fair share for a region. And what they found was that it was really decisive what principle you use. Like if we have right to development, where we look at poverty levels in Europe versus the rest of the world, the Human Development Index and other indicators, then it would only be 4% of the global safe operating space that could be used by European people residing in the EU. Whereas if sovereignty is the principle used, where this involves approaches like grandfathering, land area, and the economic productivity, then it would be something like 3 times as much, nearly 13% of the global safe operating space that Europe could use. So it really matters what approach that is taken. And so these are the results for, well, only 4 impact categories. So the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle. I know these can sound a bit strange to you because it's names from the Planetary Boundaries framework, but it relates to emissions of nitrogen and phosphorus. Land system change, which relates to land use, especially of forested land, and freshwater use. And what they used also kind of a traffic lights system. So if you are in the green, if your impact is in the green zone, then it is below the allocated safe operating space, no matter the allocation principle used. Whereas if it's in the red zone, then it is too high, no matter what allocation principle is used. And what you see is that it's really only for, so the impact is the 3 black dots. And it's really only for freshwater use that the impact is kind of systematically low enough, no matter what perspective on distribution or fairness is applied. For land system change and the 2 emission categories, the impact is sort of systematically found to be too high, no matter what the approach is taken. And this is, and for the nitrogen emissions, the impacts are up to a factor of 3 or something like that, too high. Right. So these were 3 examples that hopefully shows that you can use this kind of planetary boundary-based LCA for a variety of different questions, some involving small and detailed things like individual companies, and others involving the consumption of entire world regions. So now I will get into some of the potentials and challenges for mainstreaming this approach that I see. So I think one strong potential is that, as I showed you, the science-based targets for climate change at the company level is enjoying actually a lot of success, at least in terms of the number of companies that set targets. And so because of that, there are methods and guidelines that are under development for other environmental issues like land use and water and biodiversity to set similarly science-based targets. And this is something that is organized by the Global Commons Alliance through the Earth Commission and the Science Based Targets Network. That's something you can look up later if you are more interested. Also, a shout out to the LCA community. We have a little network that we call LC Absolute, where we are also trying to have an online database of all the different studies that are out there, and sometimes we also do studies on our own to help kind of synthesize the development that's happening and review it. Then for the challenges, the first one is that there's no Paris Agreement for anything else than climate change. That means that even though there are planetary boundaries that have been estimated by the scientific community, they don't have the same legitimacy as the goal of the Paris Agreement amongst amongst stakeholders in general. And also there's not the same urgency to act as you have for climate change. So yeah, I think we as a community, if we want to move forward with this agenda, we have to continue doing what we do and tell people not to only calculate a carbon footprint, but to really be systematic in addressing impacts in order to identify trade-offs. Second challenge is that threshold and boundaries, they are often of a regional nature and instead of a global nature, and sometimes they are dynamic. These maps here are from a study that I did last year related to freshwater consumption. Basically, the more red a watershed is, the smaller the value of the regional boundary is. And you can see that this is quite intuitive. It varies both in space. There are some areas that are always dry and others that always have a lot of water, but it also varies in time. There are in some areas, you have a wet season and a dry season. And this really complicates things. Climate change is a horrible thing, but the nice thing about it is that it's quite easy to work with conceptually because it doesn't matter where your emission takes place, right? We tried also in another study from last year to sort of propose an approach where when you do your life cycle assessment, instead of aggregating the impact across different processes and comparing that to some sort of allocated safe operating space, we sort of encourage practitioners to do it at the process level. For the processes that have the highest environmental impact, you should compare the impact of the individual process to the regional safe operating space rather than aggregating and then comparing. This is kind of logically from a logical way forward from a conceptual perspective, but it's definitely not easy to carry out in practice. And so we need much more software and database support than we have at the moment for these type of emerging assessments. I have a few broader reflections before concluding. There are a couple of downsides to the whole pie cutting metaphor. First of all, as you know, you cannot always attribute the impact happening somewhere to one specific actor. There are all these different accounting principles that can be used to attribute global impacts to different actors. And you often have overlaps. So for example, different companies one company may have a direct impact, but if the other company is the one buying the products, who is really responsible for the impact? Also, in terms of companies and governments, companies are not necessarily gonna move on environmental issues unless governments incentivize them with, for example, taxes and subsidies. The same in terms of companies and investors. It's really investors that are putting a lot of constraints, but also enabling companies to move in terms of the environmental agenda. Finally, between companies and consumer, that there's the kind of age-old debate in the environmental movement about some people tend to blame all the evil companies, and others tend to blame all the bad people like you and me that consume the products in too high quantities, etc., etc. And because there's not an sort of objective way of assigning responsibility, this makes it a bit tricky when using this kind of pie cutting metaphor. Also, there's of course no global consensus on what a fair way of sharing a global resource like a safe operating space or like our carbon budget is. And because of that, you could imagine a scenario where each actor is kind of picking the approach that gives them the most favorable outcome. We actually had a scenario like that in our study on science-based targets that came out some months ago. This is completely theoretical. The companies are not real, But we imagine that there are 8 companies in the world that all set a science-based target and all follow their science-based targets, but they each choose the sharing approach, the allocation approach that gives them the easiest target, so to say. And you can see then that the sort of stacked carbon emissions of these 8 companies, it overshoots the allowable global emissions, which is the black line here. And there are similar studies finding the same patterns between nations. Different nations can use different arguments for why they deserve a certain share of the global carbon budget. But as long as no one agrees, there's a likelihood that even if everyone sets a target, but using different principles for setting it, we might end up in a sort of overshoot situation. Finally, this whole logic of cutting a cake according to some sort of fair allocation algorithm, it follows the logic of rule-based ethics. And rule-based ethics only work if every actor is on board. And the reality is that a lot of actors are probably not on board. And so it's one of those tragedy of the commons problems. And moreover, the whole cake cutting approach could maybe even dissuade some actors that consider themselves ambitious to sort of do more than their fair share. At least this is some people have criticized the approach for maybe leading to that. And all of this really shows that there are really limits of voluntary measures and corporate self-governance. Because all of these examples I mentioned, the science-based targets, the other, the PB-LCA, etc., this is all something that is used within the context of voluntary frameworks, right? But there are clear limits to how much we can move in a sustainable direction by just relying on voluntary actions of different actors, I believe. So take-home messages. I think that PB-LCA is needed in addition to traditional LCA, not to replace it, but in addition. There's been a lot of methods developed recently, and there's still ongoing method development. And even though at the moment we're not seeing PB-LCA being used a lot directly in decision support, but the fact that science-based targets for companies for their greenhouse gas emissions is becoming a bigger and bigger success in terms of how many companies are setting targets, I think that could lead to also the adoption of broader absolute assessments and target setting. Finally, this is not a silver bullet. It definitely does not settle the discussion about what a sustainable society looks like or how to get to that sustainable society. It's not meant to kind of shut down that discussion. And it's also not a replacement of government regulation. And with that, I've reached the thank you slide. So thanks a lot for listening. I hope it was an okay experience. I think it would have been much better to speak to you from a big stage and feel your energy, etc. But I hope it was worthwhile to listen in nevertheless. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anders. It was, at least personally, very interesting to me. And I have a handful of questions I can ask. I saw one question come in the chat, or maybe comment, which was sort of very specific to the second example I think you gave on the US electricity.
Okay. Yeah,
and
I can run back to those slides in case it's needed.
Sure. And the comment was just that it seemed that not all the planetary boundaries were represented in the results of this example. In particular, biodiversity was not represented.
That's true. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. The authors, they had some problems, some technical problems, actually translating a life cycle inventory to the indicator that is used for biosphere integrity or biodiversity by the planetary boundaries, and so they left it out. So that's a shortcoming for sure. Also, within the planetary boundaries framework, in 2015, when the last big update was done, they only had they had 2 interim indicators for biodiversity, and they were sort of being very explicit about how they were not perfect and they were looking for better indicators. And so I think because of that, the LCA community that has tried to link with planetary boundaries have have been more trying to wait for the new indicators, but it's been a while now.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying that. I see one hand raised. Sorry for butchering your name. Amon Edemani, go ahead.
That's close enough, actually. It's pronounced amen, like amen. Thank you very much, Andrew. Fantastic presentation. I'll make it very quick. It seems to me that sort of assigning a safe operating space for an end use of consumption or a product using a top-down approach can be somewhat normative or somewhat arbitrary. Do we measure the extent to which that consumption can be necessary or can maybe contribute to basic needs and thus should be safeguarded from encroaching upon by environmentalists? I'm just joking here, but I guess to rephrase, is there more of a bottom-up allocation approach that would carve a larger allowable space for uses that are relative to ensuring basic needs, ensuring poverty alleviation efforts? Or do you see that as a potentially gameable approach where companies could just say, well, my products is used in poor countries and so should be safeguarded and should not have to go through this environmental regulation mess, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I got the essence of your question, and I think it's a very important one. So basically, if we take the Science-Based Targets Initiative as an example, there's no criteria that relates to the potential of the products to fulfill basic needs. The criteria is all about if there's a differentiation between sectors. It's basically based on sectors where it's cheap to reduce emissions. They are expected to reduce emissions faster than sectors where it's very expensive. So that's applying a sort of cost optimization logic, and it has nothing to say about whether the products produced contribute to happiness, fulfillment, or basic needs of people. And so, yeah, so the whole science-based targets framework or methodology is relying on an allocation approach that look at criteria for production alone. There's no link really to the consumption, but you have a set of other criteria that relates to consumption, like the ones I showed here. For example, an equal per capita approach will say that every person on the planet has the right to the same share. And then, of course, that person, actually, I was involved in a research project where we tried to sort of use this approach to figure out what products do people really care about. If they need to reduce their overall impact by a factor 2 or something, what products will they choose to still consume and what will they choose to live without? And this was a very interesting and not very conclusive experiment, but at least at least there are principles that have more to do with the equality between people, or fairness in terms of distributions between people. That's one set of fairness principles, and another set is more about the production alone. And so, yeah, there's and it kind of relates to what I was mentioning also in the end. Can we just rely on corporate science-based targets to do all the reduction by themselves without having to make any changes to consumption? There's a lot of literature saying probably not, if you want to meet the 1.5 degree target. But this is all the logic that is built into the science-based targets approach. But yeah, there's a lot of other approaches that is about fair shares between people and between different consumption categories. I hope that kind of answered your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. I do not see other questions in the chat and no other hands raised. So just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you, or drop your question in the chat. I can stall a little with some of my own questions while you think of yours. I'm particular, I think it seems the crux of linking LCA and planetary boundaries really falls down to this question of how to allocate a sustainable share in an equitable way. And I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Anders? I mean, should it simply be a per capita allocation by planetary boundary? You know, you each get 10 grams of CO2 equivalents per year? Or, I mean, how do you reflect sort of historical or systemic inequalities when you distribute those resources? Should someone in Monaco be allocated the same sustainable share as someone in, I don't know, Bhutan or something?
Yeah, so the equal per capita principle might sound very objective or sort of appealing and like, oh yeah, of course this is the good one when we talk about finding fair shares between people. But it might not be in all cases. When it comes to climate change, CO2, as you know, stays in the atmosphere for so long. And if we live in developed countries like most of us do, then all the services we enjoy today, the quality of life, is related to historic CO2 emissions, all the infrastructure, industrialization happening, etc., that has led us to this point where we enjoy fairly nice lives. This is all based on a lot of past emissions that are still lingering in the atmosphere. And so that sort of invites to a historic responsibility approach where we have to, at least at the country level, rich countries have to sort of pay back a debt by not emitting as much per capita as poorer countries in the future. So there's a lot of allocation principles looking into that as well. And I gotta say, I don't think that we as practitioners, we as researchers developing these methods and the practitioners that apply them, we should not be the one deciding what the fair approach is. I think it's important to have stakeholder consultation. I'm still amazed about how little we know about what people think is fair. I see so many studies applying these fairness principles and just referring to literature on fairness that you know derive them mathematically, etc., and just apply principles that have been used a lot in the literature in the past. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they have wide support in society. So I think we need more stakeholder consultation. But oftentimes you will get in a situation where your impact is way too high, no matter what principle you use. And when that is the case, you still know what direction to go in. So it doesn't always fully, it's not always up in the air in terms of the principles that decides whether something is sustainable or not.
Yeah. Awesome, thanks. We did see a few questions come in. Two folks congratulating you on a great presentation. The first question, what are your thoughts on how these approaches should be taught to either students or professionals, practitioners? And then follow on, what are your thoughts on how, on what it would take to get meaningful uptake of this approach at the company or national or subnational or industry level? So how do you teach it and where, and how do you get people to accept it, governments and otherwise?
Well, thanks a lot for those questions. I wish I was more involved in teaching these days, but I'm not that involved. I don't run courses myself, but I sort of imagine that it could be an element of your, you know, there are all these different universities worldwide that teach a kind of LCA 101 course. And I think this could be an element of that course. I think already at the Technical University of Denmark, if I'm not mistaken, Michael Hauschild and the other researchers there, they have this as a kind of element within their LCA 101 as a sort of alternative or complementary perspective. In terms of teaching it to practitioners, I wish I could give a better answer, but I'm kind of in my ivory tower just producing research papers, and I'm not enough in touch with practitioners to really give a very good answer on that. But I'd love to. You can always reach out to me with the email address on the slide here if you want to discuss more. I'm very happy to take a discussion afterwards. The second question about uptake, I think that there's some sort of external pressure that's needed by companies. It is not enough that someone within the organization really thinks this is a good idea, but because they think they want to do more for the environment. But what you start seeing is now that big institutional investors like pension funds, they are starting to look into criteria that requires companies to have set a science-based target and to be on track to meeting it. Right now, they are still focusing very much on climate change, but I think that this will eventually spill over to other types of impacts as well. So at least from the investment side, there's some hope that there's a kind of correction happening within the capitalist system, but there's also reason to be skeptic. We've been heard about these things. We heard about these things about corrections for many years, and we're still not in the best of directions. So I really think some sort of regulation will be needed as well, and maybe some sort of a UN run management of science-based targets. And that's make sure there's there are different ways of looking into this, but I think there's a limit to how much you can do with voluntary measures.
Excellent, thank you for that. Got a few more questions coming in. I'm just going in order here. A follow-on, I guess, to the earlier discussion on allocation. This question is, what would you say is the next step going forward in allocating the safe operating space between continents? I think maybe you touched on this a bit with the question about, equitable distribution. Do you want to add anything to that, or any new thoughts?
I think that there's a lot of inspiration to be had in the whole the process in UNFCCC, so the United Nations framework for climate change. And there has been a lot of discussions about what is a fair way of sharing the remaining carbon budget as a resource, but also sharing the burden to reduce between nations. And so actually every IPCC report has some content related to these discussions, but of course not prescribing a certain approach. And I'm not sure there's going to be I think this is inherently difficult and complicated and contentious. I don't think it's just a matter of finding the perfect principle that no one has thought about before. I think no matter what principle you put on the table, there's going to be some actor that is not satisfied. And so it's a kind of messy world. And so there's only this idea of solving problems by allocating global burden or a global resource. It can really only take us so far in solving a problem.
That's a fair point. I want to add or ask as a follow-on, what other tools or concepts would you advocate for in addition to this expanded view of planetary boundaries to actually help achieve a stable Earth system? I mean, you talked about, you showed at the beginning sort of a rough example of the impact IPAT formula, right? Population and affluence. But, are we going to be talking about limits to growth again? Is that acceptable? Should we be talking about reducing consumption as well? I don't know. I don't want to take your answers, but what do you think? I mean, what else is there if not measuring first that we're exceeding these boundaries? What other tools are at our disposal to help live within them?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and of course, it's totally out of my comfort zone as an environmental engineer. But I'll try to give some speculations. So I think first of all, we should really all actors that claim to do something that is sustainable or in the interest of sustainability, we should hold them accountable by asking them to reduce absolute emissions, absolute impacts. You cannot just get away with reducing emission intensities and growing your absolute impacts. So this is a quite pragmatic way of at least moving in the right direction by asking all actors to reduce absolute impacts. The question if it's going to get us to where we need to go fast enough, because as you know, with many environmental impacts, it's kind of the cumulative impacts that matter, CO2, etc. But I think this is one simple way of at least making sure something is happening while we discuss all these more complicated themes where there's not agreement. And then in terms of the governance system, what can I say? You know, before the pandemic, there was all these ideas of what governments could and could not do, but it seems to have been challenged a lot. People can see with their own eyes that governments can actually do quite a lot when there's an emergency. They can ask business to do things that no one would thought was possible a couple of years earlier. So maybe with this experience with the global pandemic, we can see that governments can play a more direct role in governing.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, that's an unanswerable question, but nice try. All right, let me go back to the chat. We've got a question on thoughts about how to incorporate the sort of time or temporal dimension in planetary boundary allocation. The example is GHG emissions today drive future negative climate feedback loops like melting glaciers and so on. So,
yeah,
you know, and this might have similar, this temporal dimension might be similar for other planetary boundaries as well. So any thoughts on how to incorporate that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so basically in the impact categories we are used to from life cycle assessment or in the different Earth system processes they use in the planetary boundaries framework, quite a lot of them can be characterized by if it's an emission, then after you emit it, you will see an impact, and then it will relatively quickly sort of disappear again. And this is impacts like that. You can talk about a steady state situation where if you stabilize your emissions or your resource consumption, then the environmental state will also stabilize relatively quickly. So if you reach like a stable emission of nitrogen into a river that feeds into a lake, then at least according to our models, and kind of disregarding seasons and stuff, but we would sort of expect the concentration of nitrogen to reach a sort of stable level, quasi-stable level, if you have a constant emission. But the tricky thing with climate change is that it doesn't work like that. It's more like if we stabilize CO2 emissions, we will kind of see somewhat of a linear increase of concentration in the atmosphere and therefore temperature eventually. So with those types of impacts, it's a good point. We really have to not just look at what is emitted this year, but look at the cumulative emissions. And this is also what science-based targets for CO2 emissions and other GHGs invite to this perspective, where they provide a target year, but it's not just the emissions in the target year that has to be hitting the target or below. It's also the pathway to getting from current or baseline year emissions to the target year that has to follow a sort of a company level prescribed pathway. So indeed, for a lot of, for some impacts, most notably climate change in terms of CO2 emissions, it's really important to take a cumulative perspective.
Excellent, thank you. This is a very good and practical question. Where can one go to find examples of this, of linking LCA and planetary boundaries, tools, research, etc.?
Yeah.
Should we just email you, or is there a better way?
You are very welcome to email me. There's also this, you still see my screen, right? Yeah. Where are we? Yeah, so if you go, if you just Google LC Absolute, LCA Absolute, if you Google that, it should take you to the website. It's run by my colleagues at the Technical University of Denmark, and they try to update it at least once a month. And it contains at least some news about new studies. There's also on that website, there's also a link to the review paper that we did in this research network. It's a couple of years old now, so it doesn't have up-to-date information, but it still gives you a very good idea of how the field started and some quite important publications that come out. But you're very important to write me as well with this email.
Awesome, great. Let's see, we've got a specific question again about the second example, the electricity one. In the scenario where there was no feasible solution, I guess that was business as usual into 2030, to stay within the safe operating space. What are your thoughts about taking the findings there on the left to shape public policy, to make decisions from? I mean, if we do nothing, basically we will exceed 6 or whatever planetary boundaries. How do you use that information to shape public policy?
Well, I think that when a decision maker, such as a public body, or it could be someone in a company, they ask for a life cycle assessment, and it's gonna show them some different scenarios, and you can typically point out the scenario that has the lower impact. But then you would often hear the question, well, is this so what should I, is this good enough? Where should I actually aim? And I think that even though this is really tough news, if you kind of like business as usual, at least it provides you with some sort of medium to long-term goal to aim for. And I know that within the European Union, there has been quite a lot of studies at the nation scale that has been ordered, or how do you say?
Commissioned.
Commission, that's the word I was looking for. Commissioned by government bodies. Of course, it's hard to know as an outsider how it's actually used and how it's taken up, but at least there's an interest in these types of studies. So I think it's something that we'll see more.
Excellent. All right, we've got maybe just a few minutes left. There was one other question, which is a good one, just recognizing that the whatever criteria are used to allocate the safe operating space are very likely not static, such as population. So, what are your thoughts on that? Is this, should we agree collectively as a planet on the way to allocate our safe operating space? Is this something we would have to do, refine every year? And what does that actually mean, right? If I'm granted 10 units one year and then 5 the next, and my house is a 10-unit house, what do I do? Like, do I have to let someone move into my house, or how does this work in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I think we need to distinguish between the principles themselves and then the parameter values going into the principles. And so it's true with the equal per capita principle, just to take that as an example, because global population is increasing, it would mean that every year you would have a little bit less than the year before. But then again, it's not like it's the only thing that's dynamic. The energy system is also dynamic. So hopefully, the things that you eat can be produced a little bit more efficiently than the year before. But still, that's probably going to be, no matter what approach you use to allocating to individuals, that's probably going to have to be made some tough choices. But in terms of the whether we can agree on something globally, I think maybe we can agree what is not good principles. So we can maybe exclude some from some of the candidates, let's say, but I don't really envision that we can ever fully agree on a specific principle. I think the different experiences that people are living on this planet will kind of prevent something from like that from happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot ever meet the Paris Agreement, stay within the planetary boundaries. I don't think we necessarily need to agree on a single principle, but we need to have discussions about what different people find fair, and hopefully there's a way of staying within things globally while still allowing some flexibility for some people that feel in one way and others that feel in another way.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I have one last one that's kind of a weird one, so I hope you'll humor me on it. I guess I'm curious, do you think LCA, as it's been practiced for the most part for the last, whatever, 40 to 50 years since its inception, can continue to exist in parallel to doing LCA and linking it to issues of planetary boundaries? Or is, I don't know how to ask it without sounding harsh, like, have the LCAs that have just been done at the product scale and have promoted sort of eco-efficiency been sufficient enough? Have they achieved anything meaningful, or should we now always have to do LCA with planetary boundaries?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? So it would be interesting to have a parallel universe where LCA was never invented or used and see whether impacts are much lower there or not. You will always have skeptics that also argue that LCA just kind of allow powerful incumbent actors to kind of continue doing more or less what they used to, but then put a little bit of green glimmer over their things. So you can have different opinions about that, but I don't think that the absolute perspective has to sort of push out the traditional LCA. I think they fundamentally answer different questions. I just think it's important to also ask these big picture questions and not have tunnel vision on all the details at the product level.
Awesome. All right. Well, Anders, thank you so much for your time. I would implore everyone to give a virtual round of applause. So thank you so much for speaking today and for fielding all these questions. It's been really interesting for me and hopefully for everyone on the call. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beth for just a couple housekeeping items before we wrap up.
Thank you, everyone.